Great pleasure to be back in DAG and this wonderful exhibition, which I hope that you all have had an opportunity to walk around. And it's amazing to see these, all of these. We've seen these views, some of us stray prints on display sometimes, or much more commonly digitally on websites, etc. But to see them all beautifully framed here is quite amazing. And if you haven't looked at them, do take the opportunity to go through all of this in time. Just a little bit of background. We are going to, of course, talk about Hodges, who took these three separate journeys through what is the Doab. He went from Calcutta right up to Agra, and that was about it. And he came down through central India, a bit of Gwalior, etc. And he painted these amazing scenes, which in many ways really set the tone for how in Britain people were looking at India. In some way, it's interesting, he was, in fact, this is at the very beginning of the British expansion into the upper provinces, as they say, because it is possible for him to move up the Doab simply because he has official British patronage. The Governor General Warren Hastings, he accompanies him to a lot of places. There are some places which are so disturbed from a war point of view that he cannot visit them at all. For instance, he intended to do a lot more in South India, and he doesn't get a chance to do that. He cannot come to Delhi because Delhi also is facing a lot of troubles, as they used to call them. Anyhow, he does actually make these sketches of a lot of places which will be familiar to us, because many of them are now protected monuments. So I'd like to, and of course this conversation is about architecture, about what we do with this heritage, and we could not have a better panel to really discuss some of those things. But I'm going to I'm going to ask you, Manish, if you will like to say a little bit about, just to set the scene at least to begin with Hodges and his, what he is seeing in Bengal and some of those, because those are areas that you've also, and I was having this little discussion with you earlier about, did he go and see some of the earlier European settlements, for instance?
Yeah, we grew up with paintings, prints of Daniels and Solvins on Calcutta. To be very honest, I was not very aware about Hodges.
No, you have to on it.
And can I? Yeah. So this book, which flew to our office, William Hodges, was very revealing. To put that in perspective, I must say that Daniels and Solvins and all other paintings that we are so habituated to see in India are not so much habituated to see about William Hodges, which is now being portrayed, has been the harbinger of the subsequent painters to come to India, and therefore we are talking about. They came with an idea of drawing very picturesque images of 1770 to 1780s, the time period of William Hodges. And that's, interestingly, was the time when Bengal, which was the capital of British India, was undergoing Bengal famine. And here is a narrative that was going on, commissioned, coming to Calcutta, meeting their friends, Hastings, and the Supreme Court judge, MP, and others, who kind of promotes and sends 9-10 people for him to go to various sites and take pictures and images and make acquaintance engraving, was kind of fed into, because he didn't stay here for a very long time. And he was painting picturesque paintings of various sites that he was encountering in a country like India, starting from Murshidabad of Calcutta. I was very curious to see buildings from Calcutta where he began the journey. There's one building that he drew, rather the area Garden Reach, followed by a little upstream, a place called Chinsura, which was a Dutch place. But here I thought that, you know, what a contrast. The time was a kind of a tremendous decay and poverty, and here paintings are getting commissioned, and with what purpose? Somebody says it's soft diplomacy, somebody say that it's about letting the world know that everything is being done in India is proper. Yeah, and so there was a purpose. There was a purpose. Of course, these are fantastic documents that still lies with us. We can revisit them and see how well we have taken care of them. But the architecture always is a response, or interventions or motives are always a response. If it is a motive on architecture, it's always a response to climate, to atmosphere, to culture, politics, and so on. So I would like to leave it at that, maybe. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you place it very firmly in this whole background of colonial knowledge production. This is part of that, documenting a land, and it's done in this pictorial manner, which is very much a part of that. And it's very interesting when you look at these paintings and some of those. I was looking at, for instance, the Sikandra. You know, he makes this gateway of Sikandra, one of the things he paints. And all of his paintings, the buildings look, and it's a very picturesque approach. And the buildings look kind of ruined, a little decayed, and a lot of vegetation. Some of them are completely overgrown with vegetation. And you know, you compare, for instance, and I think Giles has done that in the book that we have. He's compared, say, the Sikandra gateway, which this guy shows in a very grey, muddy tones, and he compares that to the, say, the Indian company painters who are painting the same building with all the tile work, in fact, idealized to an extent that everything is intact. So you can see these brilliant colors in the company painting, and then you contrast it with this. So I'm just like wondering, you know, the British idealization of ruin, and we have this question that we often discuss in the conservation area, that, you know, about conservation, what are you achieving? Are you conserving ruins? Are you replicating ruins? All that. What do you think of that, Abha, in your journey as a conservation person?
Well, actually, I had a very a personal reason for my own interest in Hodges, because he's done 3 beautiful aquatints of Jaunpur, and 30 years ago that was my thesis subject. But what is amazing about most of his engravings is that there is this deep romanticism of India, of Moorish architecture, and if you see even the proportions of the building, they're much more slender. They're tall and slender, and he almost makes them Gothic. He sort of pulls the proportion. Even this one to the left, they're not so. Even Sikandra, it's not the stolid Akbar period Mughal building that it is. It's sort of elongated and made more delicate and more fragile, and therefore a ruin. So it is that romanticism which is not limited to India. It's limited to that era, because at that point you have in a lot of in English countryside, you had follies being created as fake ruins to create that sort of mood of romanticism. So in a way, I think it's not particularly like a lens he puts on for India, which I think, to me, I would not I don't read it with a colonial lens. I would just see it from the lens of an artist who is a romantic. And maybe there is very possibly there could be an underlying motivation or a political thing. But for me, I just see them as gorgeous, pieces of art of someone who looks at an object and reads it with his own romantic lens. Yeah. So it's probably, and therefore I think even when it comes to conservation, as you said, there was this idea of let's romanticize ruins. I mean, even 150 years later, you have William Morris talking about the beauty of ruins and just letting them be, and the SPAB and that entire era. And that's a point of view in conservation. And then there's another point of view of restoration, and somewheres, I mean, in some other countries, sometimes complete conjectural reconstruction's been ruling the roost as well. So in a way, to each their own, but yes, these are gorgeous as just markers of Indian monuments.
So yes, I mean that's an interesting thought. Thank you for explaining that so well. This idea of and when you come to conservation, aims of conservation, what is happening, why, how you conserve. And you are all practicing architects who have worked in the area of, who work with buildings, and buildings specifically that are not conserved as ruins, but they are buildings that have to serve as living spaces. So Vikas, would you like to weigh in on that and the kinds of challenges that brings about, and this whole idealization of heritage as monuments and ruins, and which has been the ASI's, shall we say, nationally protected monuments. And many of these buildings, I'm sure, are on the ASI list. They are all there, those which survive. So it's that category of building. But we have now expanded a lot further and talking about what heritage is.
Yeah, so when you talk of the nationally protected or state protected buildings which are there, we've been following the colonial or the British school of thought, which is to conserve it and leave it as it is. There are schools of thoughts of now restoring it back to its original, and that's something which is being debated, and we need to understand where and how much conjecture is allowed and should be allowed. So that is an area where I think it should be explored in a careful manner. But yes, when you come to unprotected monuments, I'm not talking of monuments, but listed buildings, we have grade 1, grade 2 and grade 3. So I think the flexibility for grade 3 should be there, where you are encouraging traditions of past, and the things for the needs have to be met. So that's something which comes very important, is that the lived in buildings, there is the need part of it. So that flexibility for the need should be acknowledged. We cannot be dogmatic and saying, don't do this, freeze this. That's something which goes wrong, and I think that's where the battle between development and conservation comes in. But yes, we should certainly arrest the greed part of it, which is where we see our good old buildings being eroded, and you have high rises which comes, that's completely for greed. The sad part is that despite 30 years of conservation, we've not seen any proactive government anywhere, whether local government or state government or union territories, coming forward for really encouraging and incentivizing conservation. And I think that's sad. In 75 years of India's independence, we should have one or two or three heritage cities where heritage should be the driving engine. We have smart cities, we have Hriday and other schemes, but there's nothing. When we have these kind of cities, whether you take Varanasi, Pondicherry, Daman, or any of these cities, which can easily have the potential to experiment to see how conservation can work. I think that's where the differences would be.
Manish, would you say
that you have... Yeah, I'm reminded, when Archaeological Survey of India came in, I would like to stick to these paintings as well. So, about 60, 70 years after he painted these paintings, we find Cunningham forming Archaeological Survey of India. But the motive, as presented in this book, said that they would like to kind of document these buildings as a Hodges move, and also think about its governance and management, right? I think somewhere it's mentioned. So if that is a motive, I wonder whether that got translated. Because following Hodges, Daniel and Solvins, there are a series of 20, 30 artists which came to India as an opportunity, right? And as an opportunity for employment maybe for them. And because at that time we should remember that England and the entire Europe was under huge economic recession. And all the East India companies were, so the Battle of Europe was actually fought on the river Hooghly. Yeah? So when they got the opportunity for expansion, so I think this was a very soft way of entering into an expansion and think of a long term. I sincerely believe, looking at Calcutta, the colonial construct of Calcutta, I think they thought that they're not going to go, right? And they would like to have a long term economic, political, whatnot connection, right? And that was perhaps the mistake that they did. And can we really, another question which rises in me, can we really, we can get inspired by these paintings, but can we think them as an archival merit in terms of restoration? Where do they end? Where romanticism can take you hayward? You know, as Shakespeare said, love is blind and lovers cannot see what petty follies they themselves commit, right? So romanticism can go haywire, right? So I think whether we should ask ourselves, we should not take it for granted that this is how it was, because it lacks. I would really like to see his narrative and text, which is the other book, yeah, whether it has got plans, some semblance of plans, some semblance of depth of these buildings, which then becomes very referential for informing interventions today to a great extent.
Yes, I think you're quite right. I mean, these cannot, of course, as Abha, you yourself said, I mean, there is so much artistic liberty that is taken with these kind of paintings. We were just looking at that particular dome and saying, what sort of dome exactly is that? So, so that is definitely there. Incidentally, it's interesting. I mean, in India, we had a tradition of conservation. I mean, not just repair of sites, but actual conservation, which, for instance, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, I always said for Intact that if Delhi chapter, we needed a sort of brand, a symbol, it would be Firoz Shah Tughlaq, because Firoz Shah Tughlaq is the one who goes and repairs Qutub Minar and so on and so forth, that kind of thing. So there was this thing, and incidentally, in fact, the precursor to the Archaeological Survey of India is in the Delhi Conservation Society.
Yes.
Delhi Archaeological Society, which actually carries out conservation work and excavation in Firoz Shah Kotla. It repairs the Jantar Mantar and so on and so forth. So yes, I think very much ultimately this exploration, this is just a way of giving Britons in Britain an idea of what this place looks like, but it starts slowly. Then, of course, it takes a while. Yes. This is the post-company period that the Archaeological Survey of India is formed. So, Abha, what is your view then on this interventions in protected monuments, interventions in unprotected or different kinds of, what has been your experience with dealing with all sorts, and you've dealt with all sorts of levels of protection, right?
Yes. I think what Vikas said about a city, that you have grade 1, grade 2, it also, in a way, if you look at it from the perspective of monuments, and there's national monuments, there's state monuments, what has been the Bible in a way is John Marshall's manual for for ASI for many years. And I think in a way, whatever we do, we can't criticize that, because what it does is it might not be extremely detailed, but it sets a very simple thing that, okay, don't overdo it. And for me personally, I think sometimes with monuments, the biggest fear is that over intervention, and sometimes it's better to let it just be rather than in a rush do something that you're going to regret forever. So in a way, what John Marshall's in a way his commandments to ASI have served them well for a good 100 years. And yes, there needs to be greater dialogue on perhaps on even should every monument just be frozen in time? I think at least Vikas and I, we come from a city like Bombay where heritage is very, the citizens are very intimately linked with the heritage, because we are using our buildings, whether it's a high court or the Victoria terminus or a railway station. While in all these ASI sites, which tend to be monument, they tend to be just sealed off, fenced off, and that creates it delinks the citizens from the monuments. So I asked this question when I was studying at conservation at the School of Planning 30 years ago, saying, why can't we use Arab Ki Sarai for actually, to revive uses, because that was a monument which was meant to be. But we also have this, we tend to use a lot of our heritage, it's like we treat it with kid gloves and sometimes just actually turn it into this sterile, lifeless monument just because it's a national monument. I think you don't have that problem in, say, Lincoln Cathedral. When I was training in England, at the Lincoln Cathedral, there was a cafe and there were activities happening. But in India, we tend to see this as, oh my God, this is blasphemous. How could you even think of having a restaurant at Arab Ki Sarai or something like that? And that tends to then make it very stodgy, and you just think that, oh, it's just a boring place where kids are taken in for one school excursion and they never come back, because we're not treating our monuments with that interesting layered interpretation. Or so I think that is something that we look at it more like black and white, but definitely for a national monument, less intervention is better. I think those over enthusiastic extra ones are probably more harmful.
I think a lot of it is also, about management. So I think the conservatism that you see in, say, an ASI or a State Department of Archaeology stems from that fear that you allow certain things and then it'll be very difficult to control what happens in a monument and then how it is managed, and tomorrow there'll be some damage or something, and then people will say what is happening here. So those kind of aspects are definitely there. Leading from that, I think it should not be, this is not something that I would address to you because we are very much on the same page here, and a lot of the audience as well, but still it needs to be said that there is so much heritage beyond the nationally protected or state protected monuments, the so-called unprotected, or places like Delhi where you actually have a lot of listing that is there. And you as practicing architects, how much do you think people are becoming aware of that, the potential for that heritage? And of course we keep talking about only the aspect where buildings are demolished every day. At least in Delhi we hear of all these Havelis and all that, but is this a growing area, and what needs to be done? Because do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I've been working on buildings, what you're talking, which are being pulled down, and I do see that there is a great potential of this being conserved. Not conserved, I would just say if they are repaired, you can prolong their life for 20, 30 years, and that's what should be the concern. The sad part is that when you talk of people, they are more happy to have it demolished, the people who are using it. You have to understand the reason why. It is because these are rental accommodations, and once you undergo redevelopment, it becomes ownership. So if the simple solution lies is if you reintroduce rental housing back again, which is what is the need of the hours. Why are cities giving higher FSIs is because there's no housing. If you reintroduce rental housings, you'll have, and if you can work on the rent control, which is the most difficult part. I think the whole country suffers only from this one ill which no government has been able to solve. Half your battles could be won. The third important thing is we have not experimented as how conservation can be successful. I was fortunate to work on one of the building, which is Esplanade Mansion, which was a rental housing, which was a rental building. But a advertising company came in, started paying the market rent on a leave-in license. The money was plowed back, or for that matter, even Army Navy building where Indian Airlines was occupying the whole ground floor. But when you start having someone who's paying the market rent, the whole area gets gentrified. So I think we need to have a serious approach from the government top where we can do that. Having said this, what Abha mentioned, overdoing things, that word, I think overdoing is what beautification, and that's which is the most scary part, is because the money is being poured for something which is more easily done, noticeable and glitzy, which is not what conservation is all about. The best compliments we get is what have you done? But here everything is just being overdone, and I guess that's one reason why I envy Calcutta, that you have the patina there because you don't know who's the owner of the property. So if they pull down, they'll be losing on this thing. Whereas if you go to Italy, they pay for getting the patina made. Whereas in Calcutta, so overspending of a lot of money which is there is also dangerous for conservation. Is whatever is rightly required to do the minimum intervention is what is required.
What is
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Calcutta scene then?
I just wanted to say it's important to remind ourselves that the ideology with which Archaeological Survey of India has been protecting the sites emanated primarily with a lot of discourse between Archaeological Survey of India and Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings. And William Morris, who was very annoyed and angry to see the destruction that was taking place by use of infinite, hard material in Italian great masters' buildings, actually constituted SPAB, with which Cunningham and his team and the Indians, Rakhal Sengupta and others, I still wonder when I go to Chittorgarh Fort, the restoration that was done by one of the former Director General up there, the authenticity with which it was done. Now, we see a lot of fake restoration also in places like Rajasthan, and that looks very pastiche and cliche, right? That is, I think, very important for us to remember in the name of conservation. But what happened with our institution, we failed perhaps over a long period of time since independence to gradually grow and embrace the rationale of conserving and keeping, which, all the cities that we have consulted before have done so, right? If you look at English heritage today, there no conservation plan will be passed if it doesn't have a sound business plan, right? It has to go side by side. And I think that is where we have failed to institutionalize and make it more contemporary. But Archaeological Survey of India has a wealth of technology to restore. But I think they don't have that wealth, which needs to be perhaps injected into the system, which is not, it doesn't have an architect in the entire system. It doesn't have at one point of time, I remember 10 years ago, there was this outsourcing of work of Archaeological Survey of India, which was also very sudden approach. It went to the parliament and the people were discussing and so on and so forth. And right now, the whole issue of National Monuments Authority, what kind of buildings comes around a monument. that is also equally important to their upkeep. And I won't say, I don't use the word monetization, though monetization is a very bad word in Bengal. It may not be a very bad word in Bombay, or in New York. But the point is, I think we have failed for a robust organization like Archaeological Survey of India, and subsequently all that message is not percolated down. We were too preoccupied with our first national 5-year plan, second national 5-year plan, third national 5-year plan. I think we kind of relegated this this part to a backseat, and that consequence of which we are bearing. I think there's a rebirth. I mean, there's a rebirth of intention to kind of strengthen this effort and to strengthen the local authority. Heritage has become a mandate at the municipality level, but once again, the capacity of these organizations needs to be kind of augmented. Yeah.
And I would assume that, Abha, as you said, in Bombay, a lot of this is buildings that are in use, are in private hands, institutional hands, and in some ways that is a great potential as well, because government, not everything can be a national monument, and national monuments are in their own category. And of course, this idea of, but how do you see any hope for persuading more people? Somebody, for instance, has an old home, an old shop, to persuade private individuals or institutions. Of course, you're having some success with now, I think, hopefully. What needs to be done?
I think, yes, I've worked with private owners of heritage buildings, like Opera House was shut down and forgotten for 28 years. And when we tried to raise funds for Opera House, we got no funds because from the side of the government, this was a privately owned building. We approached the World Monuments Fund and they said, we could have, it's a great building, but it's privately owned. So neither grant agencies nor government nor corporates social fund responsibility funds were available. And then, the owners really put in their own money and it was a big gamble. But having said that, what really bothers me is, again, going back to these images, there was a certain sense of a setting and a context to these monuments, which to my mind has been the biggest loss to India in the last 70, at least the last 50 odd years. And that is the biggest, if 1 or 2 monuments goes, yes, it's a loss, but we've lost the plot from cities, villages, towns. I worked on Shekhawati, and you have the most beautiful houses and havelis and streetscapes, and Rajasthan government didn't even have what is the basic tool? Do you have an urban regulatory act in your system? You don't. So we don't have the tools in our states, in our cities, to even regulate the kind of monstrosities that come up in these historic areas. Yeah. So today, yes, with 160 years of the Archaeological Survey of India, yes, these monuments are safe. But is that all? You go to Agra, I feel that you've got to put a band, you've got to literally aankhon pe patti dal ke kisi tourist ko take them from Agra railway station to the gates of Taj Mahal and then take off the band, because the rest of it is a mess. And we've created there's no sense of, we had old photographs of Chandni Chowk show a very clear, unwritten, whether, a mandate of height restriction, street facade, setback, edges, everything it's ordered. It was not a mess. But we have created a mess under under our noses in Delhi. Yeah. So that to me is what bothers me more. What have we done as a nation? We have given up, we have created a total amnesty for any kind of encroachment And because our planners have taken a leave of absence for over 75 years, what we have failed our country is urban planning. And when I was studying architecture in SPA 3 decades ago, my Khirki village, that was my undergrad thesis, and there were 111 urban villages with some of the most beautiful medieval monuments in them. I don't know how many qualify now, but in 30 years, because we created this random idea of a Lal Dora, which meant they can do what the hell they want to do, we have created urban slums, which like the buildings are tall, badly constructed, cheek by jowl, no fire safety, and that's under the nose of the central and state governments, because we choose to look away. You can't solve a problem by looking away. And to my mind, urban planning has been the biggest disaster and the biggest failure of our independent nation. I don't know if you agree with it or not, but it really gets my goat.
Yes, that would be a very somber, should be a wake-up call. I don't know if it's going to work, but yes, I quite see your point. But as we're coming to wrapping up, and we will hopefully take some questions, would you like to, each of you maybe, talk about some project, which is personal to you? I mean, a lot of the people here are not architects, may not be familiar with your work also. You want to talk about some little challenge or whatever, some building, some project that you've done.
It ranges from, building of awareness. So I remember Rajabai Tower, where I spent 2 to 3 years being stationed there in the building while we were restoring the stained glass. The idea is that everyone who was working in the library, got so involved that if the engineer was doing something wrong, they would spot it out and they would inform. So, you need to start at the grassroots level where an awareness is built, and then it works. There are many different challenges, but the best thing is if you get a good client and who understands conservation, and if a project demonstrates that you're not doing conservation just because it's trendy or but it becomes a viable financial model, as what Manish was saying. It has to have a sustainable model. It's a win-win situation. The whole of the city is showing you the redevelopment path, but it needs to be moderated with good repairs. Sad part is that where we lack, whether it is archaeological survey or any conservation architect which will have, is that we don't have executing agencies. You may be the best Zubin Mehta, but if you don't have a kind of a whole orchestra to perform, you're not going to get the best of the thing. So that's something which needs to be built. If you go to cathedrals in London, in the UK, you have guilds and you have institutions there. I don't know why the archaeological survey can't get stone craftsmen, can't have lime masons on its payroll, who will look after the building, and some good superintendent archaeologist needs to just tell them what needs to be done, how you can maintain it. The idea is giving it out and they spend money on pavings and unwanted things.
Would you like to?
Yep. We recently restored a building on the bank of the river upstream, a place called Sirampur, which is in Danish. Now, there was this 2 paintings. It was in a very dilapidated condition, almost ruined. So we revived that and converted that into a usable space. While doing that, we were encountered with a very, very peculiar issue. There was this staircase which we found upon the inspection of the foundation. But earlier, the old photographs, archival photographs in the Copenhagen Museum was showing, Danish Museum, which was showing that there was this rotunda which was housing the staircase. And one was drawn in the 1786, which shows the rotunda in the front of the picture of the same building, and the other, 1810, which shows it to be in the rear end, right? So that posed a lot of issues and discussions between me and Simon, who was the architect who used to come from Denmark. and you know how it was resolved, because when I never had any work 20, 30, 25 years prior to this, I used to take a lot of pictures all around. So I had a picture of this dilapidated building, and strangely I had also the negative, right, with no mobile times. So I printed that and I showed it to the architect from Denmark, that you see, this painting cannot be relied upon. Photograph can be relied better, right? So with that as a decision, then we thought of doing some archaeological excavation around that area, and we found the original location in terms of its foundation, and we left it like that. And the project needed a easy commutation to the first floor, for which we never used the same material. We rather proposed a steel staircase which doesn't touch the original building, which is a very important principle of conservation. And the principle is reversibility. You can bolt it and you can unbolt it at a later point, so that a future generation can do a better job than you, right? So this idea of reversibility is being proposed in very many countries, including England and Italy, but some countries have become little advanced and largely intervening, like Russia. Russia went on restoring their buildings rather extensively, and many other southern European countries. So this mad craze also caught up on us. But what is interesting is that we could resolve, because of a scientific way of knowing a photograph, which often a painting cannot be relied upon. Having said that, it has no connection with William Hodges' paintings. They are brilliant. They are brilliant, they are lovely to look at, and they definitely give us a reference point of the place and the location.
Good.
Yeah.
Lastly, Abha, any personal project, anecdote you want to share? Anything recent, whatever?
No, I think, I mean, when I come to Delhi, I'm just glad that Bikaner House is still being used by people, because it was my journey from the bus adda to the cultural center. Every time I go back, it feels good, because I think we as conservation architects know when we restore a building and give it back to use, it's like giving up your child for adoption, and if they're not looked after well, you're heartbroken. And then you don't want to go back to a lot of the projects that you've worked on. So it's just nice to finally, hopefully, have Gold Market see light of day, which is something I've waited for 16 years.
Yes.
I hope it doesn't take another 16 to start. We've just started.